give it a couple minutes. Joyce, since this is your first time with my writing workshop, I do a live stream on the YouTube for people who aren't able to be here in person. So that's what that phone is there for. So don't worry, it's not going to be filming out towards the audience. It's always filming towards the screen.
Okay, great.
I don't want to violate anybody's privacy.
Protection, what do they call that?
I mean, I'm letting you guys know now, so I mean, theoretically, if someone were to walk up here and come in front of the lens, they'll be picked up. Yeah.
Oh, hello.
So, all right. Well, good morning, everybody. I am excited for this. This is a topic that I've been wanting to do for a while, and thanks to James, that was requested. So we have a really good, fun workshop that we're going to be covering. We're talking about writing westerns. We're talking about the genre, and then there will be a writing prompt at the end. Now, the content of this is going to be a little bit shorter, so you may have a lot more time to write than you normally would. Normally, I give about 20 to 30 minutes. You might have a little bit more time, but the writing prompt is going to be really simple. I think you guys will like it. So here is our. I love these animations; they're so much fun. So here's our agenda for the day. I'm going to introduce myself, especially for Joyce, since she has never met me before. And then we'll talk about what a Western is. We'll talk about key genre elements, important considerations, tips to develop your story, and then we'll do the writing prompt, and then we'll conclude. Any questions before we jump into this?
What's the writing prompt?
So the writing prompt, because this is a writing workshop, after we go through all the content that I'm going to talk about, I give you guys an opportunity to write a story. And it doesn't have to be very long. The prompt is going to be for 250 words. I'm not worried about a word count. Just write and just have fun with it. And if you want to share afterwards, you're more than welcome to do so. All right. So, Joy, as I said, my name is Garrett Jones. I'm a local author. I'm a podcast host. I have a background in creative writing, and I have 5 books in an ongoing fantasy series called The Archives of the Sea Grand. 4 of the books are actually currently here in the library with their original cover art. I do a couple of different podcasts. One of the main ones I do is called Storytellers. That's one that I do independently. It's available on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And that one has, I'm in the start of my 6th season on that. Each season is a different topic. Then I also co-host another podcast called War of the Stars. It's a Star Wars podcast because I'm a geek.
Me too.
Awesome. And what's fun is that Star Wars does have a few Western motifs to it, especially if you look at the original film. And then there's a couple of others that I do. One on YouTube is called The Right Way. That's what I'm live streaming to right now. On that show, I do book recommendations, author interviews, and creative writing tips. And then one of my favorite genres to read in is science fiction. I love science fiction, grew up on it. My dad was a big sci-fi person. But I also have a fascination with Westerns because my dad grew up watching Westerns as a kid because my grandfather was from Oklahoma and he loved Westerns. And my grandmother, who was from Italy, loved Westerns. So, cool. So, let's talk about defining a genre. So, Westerns are a fiction genre that take place in the American West, typically in the post-Civil War, late 19th century, so like 1870 to 1899. There are some Westerns that take place in the 20th century. In fact, one of my favorites, and it's a film, it's called Cry Macho. It stars and was directed by Clint Eastwood. And it's kind of an interesting version of a Western, because while it is a Western, it takes place in the 1970s. And so that it's a little bit different, but he's a traditional cowboy who is kind of at the end of his time. He has to go into Mexico to go rescue this guy's kid. So there is a sense of justice and the kind of things that you see in the genre. If I go too fast, please let me know, and I can slow down or I can go back to a slide. Now, there are some caveats to the genre that I'll talk about in a moment. but I do want to keep moving. So, Westerns are often about cowboys, outlaws, and settlers exploring the frontier, which is typically the harsh, sparsely populated region of the American West. Some of those stories do start moving down into Mexico. I have seen some Westerns that take place as far north as the Pacific Northwest and into Canada. Very few of them though, because it's typically an American genre, not a Canadian or Mexican genre, although it has transcended cultures to some extent. And then Westerns are characterized by iconic images and themes of justice, freedom, and the struggle for survival. These are big ones. In fact, these three themes fall into one of my favorite Westerns of all time, 3:10 to Yuma, which has a strong sense of justice because you've got a murderous band of outlaws that are trying to stop their leader from being sent to prison. They're trying to go after the posse that is escorting him to the train station in Yuma, Arizona to catch that 3:10 to the prison. There's a struggle for survival because at some point they come under attack from Comanches. I think it's Comanches, I could be wrong, on the tribe. But there's a struggle for survival against the harsh climate as well as from the bands themselves. In fact, the last 15-20 minutes of the film is just one big shootout on the way from a saloon to the train station. We're only talking about maybe a quarter of a mile distance, and it's just a kill box. It is awesome. 3:10 to Yuma. It's got a good cast. It has Russell Crowe, it has Christian Bale, and a lot of other actors that you wouldn't expect to be in that film pop up. Westerns are also they typically depict the conflict between white settlers and Native Americans, the infringing on territories, and the hostilities created on both sides of the conflict. Okay? And there's a historical basis for this. It's not about. It's important that when you are, and I'll talk about this in the tips. It's important to make sure that when you are writing a story in this genre that you look at the historical basis before you jump into anything else. Any questions so far? So Westerns typically depict the cowboy. This is like the, yeah, James.
So if you do a Western, you have to do it based on history?
You don't have to. We'll talk about when blending genres as well in just a moment. But typically, though, if you're going to have something that's as real based as possible, you want to make sure that the information that you're providing is accurate. So, for example, if you're talking about a group of cowboys or lawmen who encounter native tribes, you need to know which tribes are in that particular area. Okay, you don't want to just say, oh, these Indians, because that's very generic. It feels very whitewashed, and at the same time, it takes away from the authenticity of what would have taken place during that time period. Okay, you want to be as specific as possible. You want to know your stuff, because otherwise, if someone reads it and calls you out on it, they may have a really strong case to say, hey, this is not as good of a story as you think it is. All right. But cowboys are the quintessential character of Westerns. They're the hired hand who drove cattle across the Western plains to the railheads. This was a huge deal. I mean, these trips would take, I don't know, days, weeks, months sometimes. You'd see seasons change. My grandfather grew up in Oklahoma, and I mean, he was born in 1925, 4 years before the Great Depression. He would tell me about seeing cattle ranchers driving cattle across the plains of Oklahoma to the nearest train station to get it to market. So it's really cool to have known somebody who's able to see that history. Westerns also typically depict the clash between law and order and the lawless, the struggle to tame the crime-ridden West, and that can also involve I apologize for any typos, corrupt robber barons. Whether these are railroad barons, cattle barons, property owners, bankers, they could be major outlaws. The lawmen who are doing this could be sheriffs, they could be U.S. Marshals, they could be Texas Rangers, depending on where you have your story set. All right. And this clash is a quintessential element of Westerns because there was really no other law out there. A lot of the places that were part of the West were not states within the United States yet. If they were, they barely had statehood. Because so consider when certain states became states and know how things were going. This goes back to talking about history. Know how that history played out. All right. So, for example, if you have a Western set in Utah during the late 1800s, know that Utah wasn't a state until 1899 and 1900. Okay, so you can't sit there and call it the state of Utah because at that point it was the territory of Utah, or depending on which side of it you're on, it could be called the territory of Deseret. All right, so genre characteristics. Westerns typically depict the visuals of, that's supposed to be rugged, not rugged, I apologize. Westerns typically depict the visuals of rugged landscapes, saloons, horseback riding, shootouts, and gunslingers. There's always a sense of shootouts having to be at high noon. Why? Because it's the hottest part of the day, or one of the hottest parts of the day. The sun is at its apex, right at the point at the top of the sky. It's a great time to do shootouts. That and just looks cool on camera because you don't have a lot of competing shadows or light. But shootouts can happen at any time. If you are a cowboy, just make sure there's no snake in your boots. That's a Toy Story reference. No? And then Westerns typically also depict a tone that can be gritty and realistic. This is what you see a lot of the times in some of the more it's depending on the Western. So, like for example, Riders of the Purple Sage, very gritty, very realistic. But then you can also have the more romanticized and the idealized. There was a film that came out about 25 years ago with Colin Farrell called American Outlaws. And it's about Jesse James and the James Younger gang and how they went about robbing the money trains going across the West. And the film depicts them as being these heroic characters. It romanticizes them, it idealizes them, because what they're doing is they're getting back at the railroad barons who stole their farm, killed their mother. But from a realistic and gritty side of things, they are murderers, they are thieves, they are criminals. Okay? A more realistic and gritty version would be the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, starring Casey Affleck and Brad Pitt, which depicts the last days of Jesse James before he was assassinated by one of his own friends. So something to consider as far as the characteristics and what you're trying to get at. Joy, do you need me to go back on anything?
No,
Okay.
thank you.
So the genre history. Westerns have their roots in the dime novels of the late 19th century and were popularized in film and television during the early and mid 20th century. There's also been periodic resurgences. From time to time, depending on the decade, you'll see a handful of Westerns that pop up on film and on TV. Right now, in the last few years, there's been a huge resurgence in Westerns. Shows like AMC's Hell on Wheels, about the building of the railroads is a big one. There's a new one on Netflix that just came out called Primeval America, or American Primeval. And that one specifically takes place in the Utah Territory. So these were pulp fiction that were the highlight of their day because it idealized and fictionalized the things that people only dreamed about doing. Because there's a lot of people who are wanting to go out west, to leave what they had on the East Coast and in the already established states to go out and make their fortune. And that was part of that idealized world without knowing just how gritty and how dangerous and how rugged and how sparse it could be. Now I like to incorporate quotes in my presentations, so I pulled a few because they were thematic to what we're talking about. This one's from John Wayne. He says, "Courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway." Or then we have this one from the film The Hateful Eight. "We're in the West. The West is where you make your own luck." Or this one from the classic Treasure of the Sierra Madre. "Badges? We ain't got no badges. We don't need no badges. I don't have to show you any stinking badges." Love that line. And this is from The Wild Bunch. "It ain't like it used to be, but it'll do." These are all classic films. But here's the fun thing, is that the reflected themes show individualism, frontier justice, confrontation, and courage. Those are the quintessential themes that you see being reflected in Westerns. Any questions so far? All right, so here's some key elements that you need to pay attention to. First is the setting. Okay, the setting is a vast landscape, like deserts, plains, mountains, frontier towns. Okay, some frontier towns are well established, especially if you are just along the Mississippi River or the Missouri River. Places like Kansas City or Dodge were huge western towns, but they became their own form of metropolises. Once you move beyond there into parts of Texas and Oklahoma and Arizona and New Mexico, even California, those settings and those landscapes change. Is that a hand, James? Or you just, okay. You need to have detailed descriptions of nature, weather, and immersive sensory detail. The more sensory detail that you guys can use, the better it's going to be. And then you want to use the setting as a character in the story to impact the conflict and themes that you are looking to incorporate. All right? The landscape needs to have as much involvement in the story as possible, because what kind of landscape you throw in there is going to inform your characters of what decisions they need to make to survive out there when they're not in a town. We good? That's fine. So like, I did my formative years in Arizona when I was about 4 to 7, and I remember sunsets over there, and like the sunsets over the desert were absolutely some of the most beautiful. Driving through northern Arizona between California, that little corner between California and Nevada is really fantastic. There's some great scenery, the geographic locations, the geology, the way the mountains are formed, the canyons are formed, super cool. But what's interesting is most people don't even think about this, is that Arizona would typically dry throughout the majority of the summer, you know, scalding hot, the surface of the sun, hotter than even here in Hanford, and we would get random monsoons out of the middle of nowhere. hit and you'd have rain for 2 days. And it was just insane. I remember we were living in an apartment complex and palm trees were knocked down because the roots had gotten soaked out and the winds were so high that they got knocked over. And palm trees don't typically do that because, you know, we're talking about a species of plant that survives hurricanes. So, yeah. The next thing you want to pay attention to are characters. Your protagonist, often a cowboy, lawman, or a former outlaw with a strong moral code. Okay? The antagonist is usually a villainous person, like a ruthless cattle baron, a corrupt leader, or a bandit, or as I said, a baker of some kind.
How would it be an ink?
A baker, because bankers were the wealthy people, they could control who got land and who didn't. They probably had their hand in other businesses in town. And if they're from back east, that meant they came from a lot of money. And they had a lot more resources at their disposal. And all they had to do was send one telegraph and they could make something happen. Your supporting characters could be saloon owners, ranch hands. They could be cattle drivers. Maybe it's the local kid who works at the shoe shine booth. Maybe it's the guy selling coffins because he knows all the gunslingers are going to put him in business. Maybe it's the barber who gives everyone a stylish mustache. Who knows? It's a terrible Western, but if you've ever seen, there's a comedy by Seth MacFarlane called A Million Ways to Die in the West. And they don't actually hit all 1 million ways, but it's entirely goofy. And like, there's this whole thing where Neil Patrick Harris, he's this very, he's kind of this dandy-looking guy with this fine mustache. He makes the main character feel really bad about himself, and it's super hilarious. All right, the next element that you want to pay attention to is the plot. Central conflict. This needs to be a moral dilemma involving justice, revenge, or protecting the innocent. So going back to the movie Tombstone, the central conflict is that Wyatt Earp wants to retire from being a lawman. He wants to stay out of it, but the cowboys who show up, and this is not a group of guys who are actually wrangling cattle and moving them across the land. This is a gang of criminals who kill people for a living. They get involved and they start attacking his brothers. They start attacking the town. They start creating trouble, and no one else is willing to step up. So he steps up. He volunteers. And it turns into what we know as the shootout at the OK Corral. Classic Western tropes include shootouts, high noon, cattle drives, using a lasso, which I've never been able to figure out how to do.
They're easy.
They're probably easy for you. I'm not as well versed with rope. Character arcs usually involve self-discovery or overcoming challenges. So a great example of that would be True Grit, where the little girl she's trying to find the guy who killed her dad.
Yes.
Okay, it's been such a long time since I've seen that movie. And for her, it's about self-discovery, whether or not she really wants to go through with justice or if she wants revenge. And then overcoming the challenge of having her foot cut off at the very end. And that is a challenge in and of itself because she could have died just from the injury alone.
Why is your foot cut off?
I don't remember. I think maybe it was caught in a bear trap or something. Yeah, I don't remember. I think it's either that or she got injured and they had to amputate, I think. I don't remember. But the fact is that she's this little girl. She had no parents. She was probably maybe 10 or 11, maybe 12 at most. And she's being forced into being a grown-up in a world that isn't safe for her. So here's some considerations. Research historical accuracy. Study the culture, study the speech patterns, study the clothing, and the technology of the Old West to ensure authenticity. Okay? Now, what I will say about this, if you are going to blend genres, there are a lot of people who will do that. And so you can get sci-fi westerns or steampunk westerns that get thrown out because it's a great way to mash up those two genres. There's a film that came out a few years ago called Cowboys and Aliens with Daniel Craig and Harrison Ford. And the whole premise is it takes the idea of cowboys versus Indians, but instead of Indians, it's aliens. And so everything takes place in a mostly historically accurate Wild West town. The only difference is aliens are involved. And they're trying to mine and steal gold from Earth. Don't know why. They don't really make that clear. But it's a cool concept. And the nice thing about steampunk is that you don't have to worry about digital technology being an issue because steampunk technology was actually the state-of-the-art tech for this time period. So anything that's steam or coal driven, you can use it. Okay? So just be careful about what you include when you're doing that. I also want to say that there is a caveat as far as the setting is concerned. There is one Western that I know of called Quigley Down Under that takes place in Australia, starring Tom Selleck and the late great Alan Rickman. It is a fantastic film about a cowboy. He's actually a marksman who is invited to Australia to work for this rancher who is trying to get the Aborigines off of his land. And so instead of having Native Americans, it's Aborigines, all right, First Nations people. So you can play around with that, but again, make sure you are accurate with the dialect, with the setting, with the culture, all of that. Consideration number 2, dialogue. Use authentic Western slang and idioms while maintaining readability for modern audiences. No modern slang or idioms. If I hear the phrase, "that's skibbity" in a Western, I'm going to immediately call up the author and slap them. Because at no point should 21st century Gen Alpha slang be incorporated into a story set in the 1870s. Okay?
Not even if you stay away to Texas drawl.
Not even. Not even. Is that... God. Oh, that made me laugh. Yeah, nothing does disservice to a historical period by fudging the details with modern insertions. This is where I get really frustrated with some of the historical fiction that keeps popping up on modern streaming services, where they take something and they apply modern sensibilities to it, and they completely ignore how the historical elements actually played a part. So, again, make sure your dialogue is as authentic as possible. Number 3, themes. Explore themes like individualism versus community, the struggle for justice, the harsh realities of frontier life, and the cost of violence. The note I have here is that choices, words, and actions should have consequences. If your character does something, and that same sentiment right here can apply to any genre, but I feel it applies especially in Westerns because of the harsh realities of the setting and the time period. Okay? But if your character chooses to do something, or if they talk to a person in a certain way, or if they act in a certain way, there needs to be consequences. Doesn't matter if the consequences are good, doesn't matter if they're bad, or somewhere in between, those consequences need to be real to the characters. Now, we're going to talk tips for writing westerns. Okay? Choosing a subgenre is the first one. You want to consider variations like classic cowboy westerns, revenge stories, frontier dramas, but be willing to play with mixing genres like horror and steampunk. Yeah.
What is a subgenre?
So western is the genre, right? So your typical western genres are cowboy western, revenge story, frontier justice, or frontier drama. Right? So Tombstone would be somewhere in between. There's a little bit of romanticism to the story because it idealizes Wyatt Earp as this really awesome lawman. But when you look at his personal life, it was awful. Like his wife was dying of tuberculosis, and he ended up having an affair with an actress, who he later married. So he wasn't that great of a human being, but he was a good lawman. And the film idealizes that. But there's a little bit of revenge in the plot, and there is it's a frontier drama because they're on the edge of the frontier. Tombstone was one of the last towns of its time before modernization really hit Arizona.
So it's just even more control on
Exactly. But mixing genres can be fun as well. Yeah, James.
So you can choose any genre to go with your western?
So long as you can make it work and make it believable. So certain genres don't work necessarily as well within the Western genre. And so, like for example, I mean, you can. I mean, for example, Blazing Saddles is a Western, but it's a Western comedy. The whole point, it's poking fun at some of the elements of like the traditional spaghetti Western film. So, because it's a parody. But then you take a look at like a film like Cowboys and Aliens that like I mentioned earlier, and it uses true sci-fi, hard sci-fi of like aliens and digital technology and interstellar travel and stuff like that, and incorporates that into a Western motif. One of my favorite books is it's a graphic novel series called American Vampire, and the opening of it takes place in 1895 with an outlaw named Skinner Sweet, who is I don't know where it takes place. I think it's in Arizona. It might be in New Mexico or parts of California that were still not as colonized as they were by the early 20th century. But Skinner Sweet becomes the first American vampire after running with some traditional European vampires. And unlike the traditional vampires, he's actually able to walk around in daylight when there's no moon. Is actually when he's at his weakest, and instead of being affected by wood, it's gold, because he's from America. He's different. But when it's like high noon or it's like the summer solstice, he's at his strongest. And the first volume of that was co-written by Scott Snyder and Stephen King, which Stephen King has done his own style of Western with the Gunslinger series for the Dark Tower series. Yeah.
What is steampunk?
Steampunk is where it's kind of a sci-fi genre where you have characters who use technology that is steam or coal based. Okay, so anything that you would see in an early industrialized factory or facility, like they wouldn't have cars, no, but they would have something similar. So like, have you ever seen the movie Wild Wild West, or the old TV show that it was based on? Okay, terrible movie, but it's steampunk, where you have people engineering brand new technology out of already existing technology. There's nothing digital about it. It's very analog, but at the same time, it's very cool, very new. Like having a pool ball that you press the number and it turns into a smoke grenade. So, tip number 2. You want to develop your protagonist. You need to give them a compelling backstory. You need to give them motivations. You need to give them a clear moral compass. Okay? This is a character that they have a strong sense of justice. They want to do the right thing even when it's hard for them to do, but they'll still end up doing it even if they're reluctant to do it. A lot of the times these characters come off seeming like anti-heroes. Okay? They will do the right thing, but they try to avoid the drama, they try to avoid the struggle as much as they possibly can. But you want to make sure that their backstory is solid, that it fits well within the scope of what's happening. If you have a protagonist who is a retired lawman who's going up against the outlaw that killed his brother's cousin's nephew's uncle, it's not going to be that much of a story because there's no personal tie for him. But if he's going up against the outlaw that killed his wife and child, those stakes are personal.
Cousins, uncles, nephews.
Yeah. Twice removed. Tip number 3, crafting a compelling antagonist. All right? Create a villain with clear goals and a credible threat to the protagonist. Place them on opposite sides of an issue. So, going back to the story of 3:10 to Yuma, the main antagonist of the film is a character named Charlie Prince, who is a member of the gang of outlaws that Russell Crowe leads at the beginning of the film. Russell Crowe's character gets arrested, he is taken to town, and they're going to transport him to the train station to take the 3:10 to Yuma prison. Now, Charlie Prince ends up taking over the gang, and he is ruthless, he is brutal, he is a psychopath. He starts killing his own guys when they fail to listen to his orders. Okay? To the point that when he realizes that his boss is actually willing to go to prison, he starts trying to kill his own boss. That's how dangerous he is. And Christian Bale, as the protagonist, he plays a character named Dan. Dan is caught in the middle of this. He's a family man, he's a rancher, he's got his oldest son with him, and the entire time, the conflict that he has is not just trying to survive Charlie Prince's attacks, he's also trying to show his son that he is a good man, that he is a valuable man. Because after he came back from the Civil War with a missing foot, his son thought very little of him. In fact, there's a lot of antagonism from his son. So Dan is actually having to deal with two different types of antagonists. One is his own child, who has no respect for him. The other is a man who's out to kill him. So you want to have a compelling antagonist who is a threat, who is a danger. Yeah, James?
When you said family man, don't you mean family guy?
No, I mean family man. I'm not referencing the show now. Okay, tip number 4, build tension and suspense. You want to use action sequences, cliffhangers, literal or figurative, and escalating, that's not supposed to be escalation, escalating conflicts to raise the stakes for the characters and the story. Action should be moving the plot, but it also should raise the stakes and make things more complicated for your characters. Okay? Is that a hand?
So basically give them all the mystery to solve.
No, you don't want to give them a mystery to solve. You use mystery is not an action. Okay? So you want to use for example, if you have a character getting into a gunfight, the stakes are, this is life-threatening. Okay? Maybe have a gunfight in an area where he's in a kill box. A kill box is, he's basically in this recessed lower area, and the people shooting at him are shooting from all sides from cover up above. They have an elevated position. That's a kill box. So how's he going to get out of that? That's the conflict. Or maybe he is about to do something really, really dangerous, and you change scenes, leaving the reader interested to see what that character is going to do. And then you jump back to that scene a little bit later. Okay? That would be a figurative cliffhanger. A literal cliffhanger would be if the character goes off, like, God, one of my other favorite Westerns is the film adaptation of the show Maverick, with Mel Gibson. And there's a scene where the driver of their stagecoach has a heart attack and dies. And Maverick has to slow all the horses down because they're veering towards a cliff. And right at the very end, the horses stop and he goes flying over the harness. And everyone else thinks he's died. He climbs back up off the side of the cliff and he walks up and they're just saying their goodbyes, they're saying their piece, they're praying for him. He's like, are we praying for the driver? And they just look at him and they smack him and they're like, what's wrong with you? But that was a literal cliffhanger because they thought he died, and he didn't die because he's the star of the movie, and you're only a third of the way through the film. All right, tip number 5: consider the climax. You want to design a satisfying showdown that resolves the main conflict of the story. Whatever that conflict is, whether it's a revenge plot, whether it's a Western drama or a cowboy drama, whatever it is, whatever that conflict is, you need to have something that resolves it with some kind of satisfaction. Okay? In Cry Macho, the Clint Eastwood film I mentioned before, Clint Eastwood, he's this old man. He goes and he rescues this kid from his abusive mom to bring him back into the United States. And in the process of that, they come under fire from her guys who are gun runners. And they're trying to kill him. And he knows that the only way that they're going to be safe is if they get back across the American border. But that's the struggles. They can't just cross right back over into the border because they can't go through the proper channels. They actually have to cross at a place where there's very little to no guards. And keep in mind, this is the 1970s, not modern day, so there's a little bit more involved. There's a little bit less of a struggle with that, but ultimately, he's got to rescue this kid. This kid is super, super devoted to this chicken, this rooster that he has been raising, and the rooster's name is Macho. And so there's kind of a dual meaning for the name, but this kid loves this chicken because he raised this chicken from an egg to be a fighting rooster. And so he has to figure out a way to get this chicken with the kid and save both of them. It's a really, really good story. So this brings us to our writing prompt. You're going to read the following prompt. You're going to begin a 250-word short story in the Western genre. And here's your prompt. A mysterious stranger comes to town, but nobody cares until the resident gunslinger outlaw challenges him to a showdown. Right. I'll give you guys about 30 minutes to work on that. And then if you need the screen up, it'll be up. If you need me to turn on the lights, I can do that. But that's the prompt. Have fun with it. And for those of you joining us on the live stream, thank you for joining. I'm going to close it now.